Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Jewish Museum. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the manager of public programs, and thank you for coming tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion, Decoration and Domesticity, featuring Kirsty Bell, Tom Burr, and Adam Putnam. This event is held in conjunction with the exhibition Marc Camille Chaimowicz, Your Place or Mine, on view through August 5th. So if you didn't get a chance to visit the galleries tonight, please come back and do so. We have a number of upcoming public programs and events connected to the exhibition, so if you're not already on our e-news, please visit our website and sign up for that for updates on all of our upcoming public programs. Now I would like to introduce the exhibition's curator, Kelly Taxter, who will be moderating the discussion this evening. Kelly Taxter is Associate Curator at the Jewish Museum, where she organizes contemporary exhibitions, including most recently Marc Camille Chaimowicz, Your Place or Mine. Taxter was part of the curatorial team behind the exhibitions Take Me, I'm Yours, Isaac Mizrahi, An Unruly History, and Unorthodox. She also oversees the Lobby Commission series, working with artists such as Eliza Douglas, Vivian Suter, Math Bass, and Alex Israel. Now please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Kelly Taxter.
Thanks, Jenna, and thanks everyone for coming out this evening and joining us. Whoa, it's dark and I can't really read my notes. Okay, sorry. Oops. Okay, so I've realized over the month or so that Marc Camille Chaimowicz, Your Place or Mine, has been open, that it's not an easy exhibition to summarize. His work pushes against many kinds of definitions and categories, such as furniture or sculpture, masculine or feminine, public or private, art or decoration, work or leisure, autobiography or fiction, sincerity or artifice. He seems to prefer ambiguity above all else, to position himself and his work in the midst of hazily defined things and spaces that let the mind wander and allow new ideas to emerge. When we began working on the exhibition, he suggested that I read two books, Roland Barthes' collection of essays, The Rustle of Language, and Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. The Rustle of Language includes perhaps one of Barthes' most well-known essays, The Death of the Author, published in 1968, which is the same year that Marc Camille finally returned to Paris, where he was born and lived until he was 8, and then his family moved to the UK, where he's lived and worked for the rest of his since. And that year, of course, was the year of all of the student uprising and leftist uprisings in Paris, which, from witnessing, radically changed his approach to art making. And Barthes, in the anti-authoritative spirit of that moment, claimed that the reader was the future of writing, that the anonymous reader, not a singular authorial voice, offered the possibility for multiple subjectivities, for the fracturing and opening up of meaning in a text. Bachelard's book locates the house as a poetic container and generator for the imagination. He writes that it shelters daydreaming and protects the dreamer. It is a psychic state that bespeaks intimacy. We write a room, or read a house. Thus, the reader who is reading a room leaves off reading and starts to think of some place in his own past. The spaces of the house are unwilling to remain permanently enclosed. It deploys and appears to move elsewhere without difficulty, into other times and on different planes of dream and memory. I mention these two examples because they point to ideas that we'll speak about tonight. How private, domestic space might be the subject or material for art, and the many things that get blurred, shifted, and swapped in the translation of private activity into public exhibition. As well, we'll discuss how domesticity, domestication, and decoration affect how an artwork is made and received. So, as Jenna mentioned, joining us tonight are starting in the middle, is Kirsty Bell, a writer and critic living in Berlin. She's a contributing editor to Frieze magazine and writes regularly for publications including Art in America, Art Agenda, and Moose. She has published numerous monographic catalog essays, most recently on Marc Camille Chaimowicz for an exhibition he had in Hanover, Laura Owen's Whitney Museum show, and Juliette Bleitman from a show at the Kunsthalle Bern, and Günter Forg at the Dallas Museum of Art. Her book, The Artist's House, From Workplace to Artwork, was published by Sternberg Press in 2013 and was something that I looked at and read while I was planning for this exhibition. And to her left is Tom Burr, who takes inspiration from minimalism and post-minimalism, as well as from sculpture, design, and poetry, to create his own enigmatic output. He uses what he calls a focused spectrum of humble materials and found objects, including plywood, old blankets, and t-shirts, radiators, doors, books, and bits of hardware. His work has been exhibited throughout the US and Europe at institutions such as the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, the Jewish Museum of Belgium in Brussels, the CCA Wadis Institute for Contemporary Arts in San Francisco, and New York Sculpture Center. His work is in the collections of institutions such as the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, the New York Public Library, and the Baltimore Museum. I think your show is also still open in Savannah, is that right?
That's right.
And he has a show right now at the SCAD Museum of Art in Savannah, Georgia. If you're going, I'll be there soon myself. And then finally, Adam Putnam. Wrestling with the body's relationship to light and space, Adam Putnam has engaged in mediums such as performance, drawing, and photography in his artwork. He toys with the ideas of the physical self being one with architecture and the surrounding space, and brings sexuality into his artwork through the blurring of these lines. This abstraction forces the body to become second to its environment and calls attention to the psychological depth of light and dark and their interplay with space. His work has been included in numerous solo and group exhibitions, including the 2008 Whitney Biennial, and he is represented by PPOW Gallery in New York. So with that, I'm going to turn this talking over to Kirsty, and everyone's going to give a sort of 10-minute-ish presentation about their own work, and then following that, we'll have a conversation as a group.
Is this microphone working? Can everybody hear me? Yes? Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Kelly, for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's really a pleasure, and a great pleasure also to have a chance to see Marc Camille's incredible show for the second time, having been able to come here for the opening. So it's a real thrill to be here and to be here together with Tom and Adam. So Kelly originally asked me to talk, or asked us all if we could talk about our practice, which was a bit of a dilemma for me. I'm a writer, and it's a bit difficult or maybe boring if I was to talk about my practice. So I thought that what I'll do is talk about Marc Camille's practice in relation to my work, or how he's influenced me, and basically talk about when I first came across his work and how it led and fed into this book that I wrote that Kelly mentioned, and then also this most recent text that I wrote about his exhibition at the Kestner Gesellschaft in Hanover. So I hope this is, yes, so this is the beginning of my presentation. So I'm going to start with this picture. This is, for me, a picture that or a work that I keep going back to. And I think that this was the picture that initially intrigued me about Marc Camille's work. And as I was thinking about when actually I'd first seen his work, or how I even came across it, I think that really the most important thing for me was when I found this book of his in a bookshop in Berlin. And it was this book called The World of Interiors that is being presented in the vitrines in the exhibition space here, and where he took this issue of World of Interiors from April one year, in which his own apartment had been featured, and basically went through it page by page and turned it into his own artist book. So this incredible collaging and imbrication of his own work in the existing pages. And this image itself comes up several times in that publication. It also comes up several times in this exhibition, and it's something that comes up again and again throughout his work. But it's a picture that was taken right at the beginning of his career in 1974, when he lived he moved into an apartment in London, in the East End of London, on Approach Road. And, you know, when I was having another look at this again, I was trying to figure out what it is that's so intriguing and compelling about it. So it's a picture of the artist, it's a self-portrait taken within his own domestic interior, but there are just these aspects of it that take it beyond that simple fact into something that's not ordinary at all. It is domestic, there's curtains, there's a window, there's a table, there's a lamp, but there's also these other enigmatic, weird things that you actually don't know what they are, these like ziggurats on the floor in the corner, and then this strange, fragmented arch that doesn't actually belong there, and there's no way to understand exactly what it's doing or what its relation is to him. And this arch is also something that appears in his work again and again as a kind of refrain. And Marc Camille talks about his work and this image, and particularly the series of images that he made during this very productive initial period in Approach Road, as being, and a quote from him, being neither quite public nor private. The space existed in limbo, somewhere between the world of ideas of art and the interior life of the artist. So this to me suggests that the interior is a kind of a state of truce. You know, this is also suggesting the membrane between inside and outside with the window. You can't see his face, he's looking out of the window, and he's also engaged in an activity that isn't really an activity. He's thinking, he's smoking, he's looking at something that we can't really see. So it's kind of hovering in this in-between space and this in-between time, and these kind of characteristics are something that are really like a key to his work. So when I discovered this book of Marc Camille's, it was really one of the key artists who made me start thinking about this idea of an artist working in a domestic interior space, and what that could mean. You know, there's been a lot of writing about artists' studio practice and a lot of analysis of the studio as a production space. But I realized that I wanted to kind of take those same tools and turn them to a domestic space where the activities are not so clear-cut, where it's not necessarily a place where the artist would just go to make work, but there's all of these other types of activities and parts of life that feed into it. So I started thinking about artists who work in a domestic sphere and artists' houses, but also particularly artists where their work also, where this situation is thematized explicitly in the work that they make there. And I'm not going to talk very much in detail about the book, but I do have it here in case anybody afterwards wants to have a look. I'm just going to show a couple of pictures, basically from the two other artists who were very at the beginning kind of key figures to me when I was thinking about this subject. So the second one was Frances Stark, and particularly this book of hers. It's a tiny little pamphlet produced in 1999 by Bookworks called The Architect and the Housewife, and I don't know if it's even still available in print, but it's a super fantastic book and this great text where Frances Stark in LA in the 90s is writing about the dilemma of her own artistic practice, which at that time consisted mainly of making drawings. So she's in LA and she's surrounded by these other kinds of artists, these kind of free-roaming, unsubscribed, mainly male post-studio artists who are working in a way more like an architect. Meanwhile, she's at home, the wall on which she's working, her studio is basically in her living room right behind her sofa. And she's starting to think, well, maybe I am actually more of a housewife. And in this great text in this book, she's analyzing these conditions of production and what that might mean about her work and her role as an artist. And she says, here's a quote, "One day when my kitchen was still in my living room, about 4 steps away from the kitchen, I was in the kitchen, but I was working, although drifting mentally and physically. I had a dish towel in my hand, and the word housewife came into my mind." So she's talking about this different kind of production. So it's a different take on the situation to Marc Camille, who's not working with design explicitly as such as he was at the beginning of his career and continually. But she's thinking about what it means when you're working from home, when your kitchen table is essentially your studio, and if, in some cases you're just working from your bed. And then another artist who was kind of fascinating me in these early stages of thinking about this subject was Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster. And this is a work of hers from 1992. It's one of a series of pieces called Chambre, and this is called Les Années 70. And it's basically a reimagining of her parents' bedroom from her memories of the 70s. And, and it really kind of tells a lot about this kind of patchouli-infused, kind of hippie-esque 1970s parents' bedroom. And this is another piece from the same series. It's an imagined bedroom from Rainer Werner Fassbinder. So, brown velour and low lighting and golden touches. So for Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster, she's really thinking about an imagined kind of domestic space, and for her, this really, unlike Frances, where it was really more about the conditions of her own production, for Dominique, it's about constructing these kind of imaginary domestic interiors. And she says that for her, these rooms seem to contain some half-unconscious exhibitions of the self. So the interior becomes a kind of portrait, and it's all of these peripheral details that kind of add up together to suggest something of an individual. And then eventually, when I got more into the process of working on the book, I started thinking about the house as a structure, how the house could be a sculpture, and in this case, this is Gabriel Orozco's house, the observatory house in Mexico, which is built in this cruciform structure, and it has this kind of perfect hemisphere in the middle that he's turned into a diving pool. So I was really thinking about this idea from all different angles, and eventually, after much research and many site visits, it kind of developed into this group of 20 case studies of various artists, beginning in the early 20th century with Kurt Schwitters and Florian Stettheimer, and then focusing more on contemporary artists. But as I said, it all began really with Marc Camille Chaimowicz and this idea of the artist in his interior space. So when I saw this image and I found this book and I started finding out more about his work, I really realized that I really had to meet him, and eventually met him and procured an invitation to go and visit him at home. And when I went to visit him, I had this kind of strange sense of déjà vu when we were sitting in his living room, and it was a very kind of choreographed visit, and he made us coffee, and we drank it out of little cups and saucers, very much like the cups and saucers in the room, one of the exhibitions here. And I felt like I recognized everything in the space, the armchairs, the table, these little sculptures on the floor. But then what made that even stranger was that it wasn't actually this interior, because he lived in this apartment until 1979 and then moved to a new apartment in Camberwell in 1980. But he kind of revisited the work that he'd made there and reconstructed this interior in this new space. So there's this kind of strange sense of déjà vu, which also seems to me that something that comes back through his work repeatedly. This kind of repetition and these kind of refrains that come up again and again. So there's a kind of surrogacy of these objects and these activities that kind of overwrite the practice of kind of the regular rituals of daily life. So this was a show that he had in Edinburgh at Inverleith House. And again, we can see how then this actual activity of working at home is then kind of extracted and becomes the material for an exhibition. So while you could see this kind of the interior which he devised and then remade in his second apartment as if it was a kind of model for living, you could also see this kind of design-based practice that he developed as a model for being an artist, and the possibility of introducing these other ways of working and making carpets or making textiles or furniture, and bringing in the possibility of commercial production and distribution. And another refrain in his work is this arch that you can see in the photographs, and this is also something that I don't know if it's been in every show that he's made, but I feel like it's been in every show of his that I've seen. And this is this kind of fantastic, crazy interior that was an imagined apartment for Jean Cocteau, shown at the Tate in 2012. And here the freestanding arch becomes this other kind of refrain in this kind of fictionalized, kind of hysterical interior. And here it is in a show that he had at Galerie Neu in Berlin, when he first shows these vases, some of which are also included in this exhibition. So it also becomes part of this repetition, this déjà vu. There's this kind of familiarity whenever you see it, that you know where you are. It's a kind of a staking of territory in a way. It kind of makes a claim for the space that it inhabits. So it suggests that this, for Chaimowicz, the activity of making an exhibition is also a kind of inhabitation of an interior. And here we are again back in his first apartment in Approach Road, and when he's engaged in one of these kind of typical activities that you see in many of the portrait photographs. He's looking out of the window, he's reading a book, he's lying on his bed. You know, it's these kind of activities that are characterized by a lack of action, actually. There's a kind of pensive, kind of loaded potential in there, of an interiority of self as well. Oh, I'm not sure where I'm supposed to point this. There we go. And so here's an image from his 2016 show at the Serpentine in London, and you'll notice there's some kind of similar elements to the exhibition in here, but what interested me particularly in this show is this new sculpture that you can see here, which is this kind of geometrical frame that also becomes something of a refrain in his work, and he's showed it in various situations. And here it is in another space in the Serpentine with its kind of companion arch. And this window frame, it was actually the design that he made for the windows of this building. This is a new building in London, in Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, that's home to Marc Camille Chaimowicz Gallery, Cabinet Gallery. They have the ground floor and first floor of this kind of strange bespoke building that was designed by Trevor Horn Architects, and also as a collaboration with several of the Cabinet Gallery's artists. Lucy Mackenzie made the balconies, John Knight designed the window in the lower level, and Marc Camille made these incredible oak-framed geometric windows that appear across the building. And not only is this the building where his gallery is, but he also has an apartment there on the third floor, and this is his new apartment where he's moved into after over 35 years of being in the previous place in Camberwell. And this is when I went to visit him there the first time. And, you know, I just took this picture on my iPhone, but I love it so much because he immediately assumed this pose, you know, it was incredible. Like, as it, it's like one of his own works. He's like not looking directly. He must be thinking something very profound. But with this, I also had this other strange déjà vu experience, because this was the week before in Hanover at the Kessner Gesellschaft, where he's putting together this exhibition there. And this exhibition was it's called One-to-One, the exhibition, and it's a one-to-one scale replica of his new apartment in this building in Vauxhall. So when I went to see him there, I'd already had this strange experience of being in the replica and seeing the parts of the furniture there. So again, there was this kind of strange sense of déjà vu and repetition. And here again is the window that then became kind of an integral part of this structure. And here you can see there's also these photographs on the wall, and the photographs are of the window. And just to kind of give you a sense of how intricate this exhibition was, and how he thinks about his own relationship to space that he's living in and that he's exhibiting in. He'd commissioned a series of photographs just before he moved into his new apartment, when it was all completely furnished as he wanted it to be. He commissioned a young photographer to make this series of pictures of the apartment, and then this one-to-one model was used as the set in which to exhibit these photographs. So you had permanently this case of seeing something live in the exhibition and then seeing an image of it. So these are some of the images from that were taken, and Marc Camille especially wanted this photographer to kind of take pictures before he moved in, as if it was a kind of stage set that was ready for the activity of inhabitation and kind of full of this potential. And by this stage in his career, the whole house is furnished with his own textiles, carpets, bedspreads, furniture, shelving. It's really, the house itself is like a kind of archive or like a retrospective of his own work. And this is, he has this very special pencil sharpener that I've also taken a picture of. And then, so this is the same notice board, the same working board in the model. So there's this kind of sense of these two interiors collapsing onto each other. And this uncanny sense of familiarity as you're going around the exhibition and seeing the same images in real life and then in reproduction. I feel like I could talk endlessly for hours, and I'm sure I spoke much longer than the 10 minutes that was allotted to me. But anybody who has time, I'd really recommend spending as much time as possible in this exhibition and really reading some of the texts on the walls and some of his own writings, because it's so dense and generous in this kind of ambiguous, evocative atmosphere that it gives. And this kind of uncanny sense of familiarity you have if you just go through the exhibition twice. You become very quickly familiar with these kinds of ways of thinking and these objects that he's making. And then I've just put this picture in at the end. This feels to me like that picture of Marc Camille looking out of the window, because this is the view out of my window. So when this is kind of my practice, I would say, because I'm usually sitting at my desk and looking out of the window, and this is the view that I see. So this is leading into the next project, whatever that might be. So I'm going to hand over now to Tom. There you go.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank you, Kelly, for putting this together. For me, it's a real pleasure to be in the context of Marc Camille's work and to be associated in this way. And I think, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to talk about. I think I'll be prompted by my images that I've selected, but I wanted to preface my thoughts with, I think I was aware of Marc Camille's work probably around 15 years ago or so. But about 10 years ago, I think it was 2008, I was invited to participate in an exhibition that Marc Camille had in the Netherlands at De Appel that was something of a survey of his concerns and works, but also included other artists. And I just wanted to read something that was part of the press release for that project. And the project was called In the Cherished Company of Others. And the press release said, works by Marc Camille Chaimowicz with notably numerous architectural models and artworks by a select group of international artists whom the artist feels empathy with. So I wanted this notion of empathy was something that was very interesting to me, and I think it's something that maybe we can come back to, but it really struck me when I reread and sort of visited that moment. I had not met Marc Camille at this time. I was aware of his work to a certain degree. I've become much more familiar with it since. Empathy, just to remind you, is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. The other thing that I sort of wanted to, before I sort of launch into works that may or may not relate to my relationship to Marc Camille, was the title of this exhibition, which I think is very interesting, Your Place or Mine, because I think it's something that carries through Marc Camille's work, this notion of innuendo, this notion of sexuality, this notion of assigned place and time. But I think what also happens with that title, beyond the notion of a sexual encounter or a romance, perhaps, is this notion of territory and space. And what determines one's territory and one's space. And it is, and the sort of the idea of yourself versus the other. So that I also just sort of wanted to put out there. I didn't choose images that were perhaps the more obvious images of things. I have made things that sometimes look like things that Marc Camille has done in a way, maybe. We've both done a lot of screens, a lot of partitions, a lot of work that may have dealt with interior space. Some of these images will deal with that, but not all of them. I wanted to pull the view of his work perhaps into one of a spatial practice. This is an exhibition of mine from the year 1993 in an apartment building designed by Le Corbusier in Firminy, France. There was an exhibition there. And each one of the artists, there were multiple artists, I think there were about 12, occupied one of the units in this unité designed by Le Corbusier that was not occupied. The building had half of the building occupied still, the other half was not. The artists occupied the unoccupied section of the building. And my project was called the Storage Project. And what I was thinking about was the notion of a design space, an overly designed space, and the notion of the accumulation of personal effects and the inability to hide, and the inability to hide one's sort of accumulation, life accumulation, to conceal oneself in a certain way. I was thinking about notions of the closet, both in literal senses. The project sort of went from mobile to immobile and back, thinking about built-in units, mobile units, but it was also, of course, thinking about the psychological space of the closet, the social space of the closet, the open secret. Moving on, at the same time, in the mid-90s, I did a series of exhibitions in New York that dealt with space and the notion of occupying space. I was thinking a lot about, and I think this is relevant to thinking about this sort of programmized way that Marc Camille designed this exhibition, or Marc Camille in concert with Kelly designed the exhibition into these different types of spaces, one of which was the jardin, or the garden space, right? And because of the proximity of the museum to Central Park, this becomes very, very poignant. So I was dealing with a lot of spaces in New York City at that time, one of which was Central Park, another of which was Times Square. I was interested in spaces that had been occupied by certain constituencies. I was thinking a lot about queer identity at the time. I was thinking about the disappearance of queer identity in terms of spaces that one could occupy. This was from an exhibition called 42nd Street Structures, where I was taking certain building types within that series of blocks in 1995 that were disappearing due to Giuliani's legislation at that time. This was at a gallery called American Fine Arts Company. I always like to show these images as archaic as they are, because they show a different place and time that gives a certain context, the work that wasn't the context I was speaking about at the time, but this many years later, that context of what has happened with the real estate in New York, all of that notion of displacement starts to resonate within the images as well. Another exhibition from that time period also dealing with the notion of spectatorship and public spaces in the theater. And referencing these park spaces, this is not a piece that refers to a New York City park, but it happened at the same time. This piece is called Circus 77, and it was originally the Kunsthalle in Zurich in 1995, and I displayed it at another place in Europe, and then the third time was here in New York for an exhibition I did a couple of years ago at my gallery here in New York, and it's a recreation of a section of the Plotspitz Park in Zurich, Switzerland. How it's designed to try to recreate how it could have looked, might have looked in 1977, circa 1977. Why 1977? It interested me because in the 80s, this park became the most famous needle park in Europe, and that phenomenon and Switzerland's complicated relationship to trying to clean that park up eclipsed an earlier time when it had been a gay cruising park. And I was interested to try to find that space again through that sort of white light of media that had eclipsed it. Again, issues of displacement and territory and occupying. I don't even know what this is. Oh, I see it. So this is a piece called Deep Purple. This is in the year 2000. I was thinking, at this time, this is a sort of riff on a work by Richard Serra called Tilted Arc. And Richard Serra did this piece, which is arguably the most famous controversy around public sculpture, certainly in this country. And my piece, Richard's piece, Sarah's piece was corten steel, 120 feet long. Mine was made out of plywood and 80 feet long. It's 2/3 the size. And mine was made out of plywood and painted this sort of deep purple color, which probably can fold back into conversations about decoration. I was thinking quite a bit about this. I was thinking about this notion of the artificial. And I was thinking about site specificity and notions of orthodox site specificity, and I was thinking about my work wanting to be, this piece in particular, much more opportunistic than that, much more promiscuous in a certain way. So I'm simply showing it in a few different iterations. It was first shown in Braunschweig, Germany, outside this, the Kunstverein Braunschweig was a sort of Palladian villa, where you could look out the window, and it was a survey of my work, and out of each window you could see the swath of purple. Here it is in Lausanne inside, but originally it was outside. This is a very dark image, but it's in the old, the Breuer building, the Whitney Museum uptown, and I show this image because it kind of emphasizes the adaptability that I was interested in, the sort of promiscuity that I was interested in, that I think we could talk about in relationship to Marc Camille's work in terms of creating a sort of mise en scène that can travel, where objects are never autonomous, but they're also finished by their contexts. And the work sort of miraculously fit into the courtyard, which was sort of like the planter of the Breuer building, right? The moat. With perfect wheelchair access on either side, which was extremely frustrating because I wanted the work to kind of counter this notion of site specificity, and yet it seemed so entirely site specific there. Here it is in its final resting place in France. But I show this image to you also to show you that, contrary to what Sarah was dealing with in terms of this self-supporting piece of steel, mine was much more of a 19th century incarnation, having to support itself on the back. And you also get to see a little bit more of the vivid nature of the purple color, which even after this many years has remained fairly luxurious. Thinking about domestic architecture, thinking about particularly American domestic architecture. This is a piece called Split, and it's a recreation of a 19th century outhouse, 3-seater, to scale, and split sort of Gordon Matta Clark down the middle. I am thinking quite a bit about, and particularly at this time, was thinking quite a bit about rather than the freedoms of architecture, perhaps the restraints of architecture and the controlling aspects of architecture, how they determine us as subjects. Similarly, this is a piece, and this, as I said, could have been, there are any number of lists that I could have made of images that could have related in. This one I wanted to see again, and it is called Xenophobic Volume, and perhaps also connects to this notion that architecture is always imbued with psychological aspects, investments, rectangled restraint. And to Kirsty's last image, and speaking about the notion of the artist's house and location and site and studio, many of these works, the last two included, often might include the residue of my own life. So these pieces were made during the time period when I renovated a house upstate. I decided not to put the shutters back on the house. So there's always, to me, a primary meaning and then perhaps residual secondary meanings that might get learned about through conversations like this and might get added to sort of the meaning of the work. So the fact that they are shutters from the house that I worked on and live in may or may not be important, but I think it's important. Same thing. This is a piece called Shades of Green. The house was an old house. And this is not typically the way I talk about this work, perhaps. I almost want these things to be found out and not by me. Again, perhaps we could think about Marc Camille's notion of persona and mythology, and what that means in the self-conscious construction of the idea of the artist, right? And being sort of involved in that, involved in that conflicting notion of the artist. These are shades that came from the same windows that those shutters came off of, but obviously very much removed from that context, put into a gallery context or an institutional context, and having to navigate themselves very, very differently. I was thinking about the title of this talk and the word domesticity, and I've thought about that quite a lot, and usually that conjures up images of, you know, I don't know, a well-laid table or an intimate series of objects that might have to do with the body. I was interested in that notion of the process of how something becomes domesticated, and the multiple layers and meanings that has to do with. And I've done several works at different periods of my career about that idea of domestication, having to do with behavior modification, taming, controlling. And I did a series of works. This is 2002. The show was called The Stalls. There were horse stalls that accompanied these works. They were called the put-outs. And the put-outs were produced just slightly smaller than you would for a horse, so that they felt slightly more human in scale, which created a bit more anxiety, perhaps. These were called the put-downs, and they're entirely constructed or made up of horse tack. Of course, I'm interested in the fact that, seen in a different context other than a stable or some sort of an equestrian context, these quite normal bits of clothing, harnessing, and leads, hoof covers, all of this takes on a very, very different kind of meaning and connotation within the context of a gallery situation. It's related, of course, then to the human body, even though these pieces are entirely constructed of things that were from a tech shop. Much, much later, I revisited this notion of domesticating the body controlling the body via the lens of some sort of equestrian practice through a project I did called Dressage. And I sort of used each one of the moments within the dressage pyramid, which is to turn out the perfectly performing horse, and I sort of interpreted those sort of formally, physically. This one is called Straightness. That's actually cast bronze. So there's some sort of notion of imitation play that's going on there as well. And sort of in closing, and again, perhaps, to this idea of, I don't know, it's some notion of the autobiographical, right? But I mean that in hopefully the most political way we can think about it, of speaking from where you stand, which I think perhaps is a very potent aspect of Marc Camille's practice in grounding himself and his utterance from his physical spaces that he occupied. I just finished a project in New Haven, Connecticut, which is where I was born and grew up. I had the opportunity to work in a Marcel Breuer building that was abandoned, not far from the hospital that I was born in and not far from the schools that I went to. And I called the project Body Building. And I wanted to, on some level, even though it was a public space, create some sort of a alignment between my own body and my own history and my own time frame. This building was built a few years after I was built or born or constructed in New Haven. So I wanted to kind of push those things up against each other. And this particular element, I had to deal with the codes in the building, and it's another story for another time. But I was involved in bringing the building up to code, and I used those codes and those restrictions to be the form of the work in large part. And this is a railing that I was required to build. I didn't have to build it quite like this, but it had to be to code. And I decided to design this sort of railing a bit after these fences, these iron fences in New Haven that are the one element that seems to connect the university, Yale University, with the city of New Haven. They both have historically these iron fences that have this X formation in the middle, which to me always seemed a very, very symbolic gesture when I was growing up. It felt very much of a protectionist, almost sort of xenophobic kind of gesture. So I designed that relative to this, and I wanted there to be notions of access and inability to permeate this membrane of the wall. I emphasize that by these, I don't know if you can see it in this image, and I'm at a sort of a oblique angle here, but there's glass in the panels where there is not the grid. So there are different forms of opacity and transparency, but all to code in terms of keeping bodies from passing through them. And on the top of the layer, I wanted to, in addition to this just simply being near where I grew up and about me, I wanted there to be other sorts of narratives, other sorts of historical information, other sorts of fantasies that layered into the work, that folded into the work. And on the top railing of this work, which you can't see in this image, but you can see it in this, I inscribed the entire May Day speech by the poet, playwright Jean Genet, who's also, of course, somebody that Marc Camille has thought quite a bit about. Because Jean Genet had been in New Haven in 1970, which was exactly when this building was built, when I was a young person, and had been there to speak on behalf of the Black Panther Party, which he had been doing throughout the United States at that time, and using his body, using his fame, but also his voice to speak on behalf of the goals of the Black Panther Party. So I thought I would sort of end with that as sort of a open question about the relationship between the individual artist speaking from a particular point with their own specific coordinates, and then a larger sort of social spectrum. And then I'm going to read one last thing that I found that Marc Camille had written at the time that he did the exhibition that I referred to earlier, 2008, that I was in as well. And he had an upcoming show at Secession in Vienna, a place that I've also shown. So it's a very, very special place for artists to show. It's the sort of place you think about showing most of your life. And so he was speaking about his upcoming Secession show and of the decorative panels that he first developed in Vienna in 1982. And Secession, if I didn't say it, is in Vienna. So he had developed those decorative panels in 1982 in Vienna. And he writes, or he speaks, this was in a conversation, that I've been invited to prepare a show for the Secession next year will imply the likelihood of extending that procedure of possibilities. And so the future will, in all probability, fold itself into the past, the better to accommodate the present, which I thought was kind of beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, for inviting me. But also, I had never seen Marc Camille's work until Kelly's show, so thank you for this show as well. And so, on this topic that what we've been talking about, I took the opportunity to sort of go back to some very early work for me, which was about 20 years ago, and it was from a time period in between when I was an undergrad and thinking about going to graduate school, but I hadn't quite put it together. And it was so this is just from Google Street View. This is my apartment from mid-90s, and it was that little on the right, the little red garden apartment, basement apartment, and it was a very rundown. This was in Greenpoint, wasn't what it was today. And I won't go into it, but I wound up there almost by accident. It was a very creepy apartment, but I wound up making a lot of work there, and it was at the same time, I'll just say, as a little background, I was working at the Frick Art Reference Library down the street as a book conservator, and I thought I was going to be a book conservator. But I was also doing these performances in public at a place called Exit Art, which probably no one knows about anymore, but it was this non-for-profit, kind of an anachronism now. But so between the Frick and Exit Art, I was also staying in this strange apartment, which was fully furnished, by the way, by the really creepy Polish landlord who lived on the top floor. So it was just, I kind of, this is also work that I would consider to be the first work that I put out there in the world. It's probably also dates from the mid-90s. So at a certain point, I don't know how, why, or what. We were all joking that we should maybe do this talk on a therapist's couch. And just leave it there. But anyway, I just started stuffing myself into pieces of furniture. But not just doing that. I mean, as I said, my first idea of being an artist was very connected to performance and my body and all these things that actually Tom was talking about very eloquently. And I love this idea of also portraiture as the kind of finding your coordinates in a place. And anyway, this was just a place that I was living my life in, but I was also doing these strange things. And it was also, for me, not only so I was performing publicly, but then coming home and doing these private performances in front of a camera, and you can see, I don't have a laser pointer, but there's a cable coming out of the dish cabinet, or here there's a cable coming out of the bookshelf. So there was no one else in the room. It was just me and a tripod and this bubble release. And for me, digging out these pictures, I'm almost transported back to this kitchen, which and I guess one of the things I was just thinking about as you guys were talking too is this idea of atmosphere that was permeating the apartment, but also I think sunk into my work. So I was there for 3 years, and a lot of cigarettes were smoked in this kitchen, and a lot of coffee. And at a certain point, and again, I had this creepy guy living upstairs. I'm also, a child of science fiction, horror movies, and Edgar Allan Poe, and all that sort of thing. At a certain point, I noticed on the far end of the kitchen, this linoleum had been worn down a little bit, and I I'm a horrible tenant for doing this, but I sliced the linoleum and discovered that, in fact, the floorboards underneath had been cut away. And I realized in the front of the apartment, similarly, the floorboards had been cut, and I realized that they were 2 trap doors, and so of course, I pried them up. And so I want to say also, this isn't, those first photos I consider artwork. This is just kind of a document of something I don't know. So I'm just sharing you guys, don't tell anyone. But I actually, crawled under, I kind of can't believe I did this. But I had a friend at the time who was this really beautiful, brilliant sculptor. I don't know where he is now, but he made me a breathing device. And so we sort of wound up collaborating. And I guess I should say that on the one hand, I wasn't really quite aware of what I was doing, but I sort of was. And it was really a formative time for me where I really was fleshing out this division between private and public, and my problems with even the word performance, the idea of performing publicly, and how that was so connected to entertainment and being responsible for an audience. And so we had actually kind of came up with this idea of staging a performance. This is the last thing I did. I eventually did decide to go to graduate school, so this is the last thing I did. This is a farewell to the apartment. We invited people to the apartment and sort of did a semi-public performance where people came in, they had to walk through this kind of crappy neighborhood and come into this crappy building, and they discovered me. I wish I had the video. It's on some tape that needs to get transferred, but we had mic'd my breathing, which was coming through this tube that was connected to the bed. And Hajime had also made this little really not so subtle reservoir of goo in the middle of the bed that would bubble up as I breathed. But the other reason why I'm sort of lingering on this image, and this is a photo that I took, I painted the walls blue, which is neither here nor there, except that after I left the apartment, actually photographing it photographs green, so it's sort of a blue-green. I went to graduate school, a very prestigious sculpture department, and was faced with a crisis because for the first time I had a studio, and I was surrounded by dutiful graduate students hammering and sawing and doing all these things, and I was in a panic because I wasn't making anything. And so in a crisis, I made a stage set, which is maybe another way that I kind of process Camille's work as sets. In fact, one of the first things I'd mentioned to Kelly when I first saw the show is that it reminded me that the tableau, the carpet, reminds me, if anyone's seen The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, the Fassbinder movie. So anyway, I was all gung-ho, I'm gonna make a movie, I'm here in graduate school, this is it, I'm doing it. And I got as far as making the set, and I realized that I had recreated the living room, or this room, from my apartment. So it's just this funny idea that I've noticed, and I'm just sort of highlighting for the sake of this talk, which is that also at the time I just made a concerted effort to take my body out of the work, and it was replaced for some reason by this empty blue room. That over the years, I'm not even showing you the half of it, but it just kind of became extrapolated in lots of different ways. This is also a very early piece that I did, and eventually I started making stuff in graduate school. And this was what would become a series of very clunky projection devices that I called magic lanterns. And this was the first one. It was in a way meant to be a farewell to this blue room. But what would happen is, it's a scan from a slide, so it's very chewed up. But you light a candle and this projection of a blue room would just sort of quiver, which then became, more elaborate. It's kind of hard to see, it's washed out. The lantern, these projection pieces became bigger and more elaborate. The blue room became a hallway, and and I think if I were to really encapsulate my work, it's been a constant play between inside and outside, interior and exterior, as Tom was saying, along with all the associations an interior carries, both psychological, physical, architectural. So this is kind of speeding up, this maybe 10 years ago. And a lot of my work kind of doesn't organize itself in a straight line. So I'm often, as I'm maybe working on these lanterns, I'll be doing a drawing, and a big sort of side project, or I've shown them, are these really elaborate two-point perspective architectural drawings. And also around this time, which was about 10 years ago, is when I moved into the studio that I have now. And it's almost as if I had a similar crisis. Here I am in this white, I don't know, I'm sure every artist can face this. It's the blank, or every writer, the blank page, the blank wall, the blank canvas. And I had not been in my work for a long time, and so I think just to sort of push something along, I started taking pictures of myself again very quickly. And I wasn't intending to do anything, but they wound up with these, but they wound up becoming a body of work that I showed. This one's very poetically called Sneaker Face. And again, it's years later, but in many ways it's imported this thing that was happening in my apartment many years ago, where it was just setting up the camera with a bubble release or timer, no assistance, no anything. And quickness in the moment. I'm sort of up to this, one of my very recent pieces, which is, it's funny to call it recent because it's basically the culmination of 10 years of work. It's work that was started when I was kind of the sneaker face photo. But it's a piece, it's a film or a video, whatever you want to call it, that I entitled Reclaimed Empire. And it's made up of, at this point, about 80 or 90 short videos or fragments that are strung together into one long piece. And what it really is the culmination of all these strange ways of working, but culminating these short videos. So in the videos, I'm just going to flip through a bunch of stills. In much the way that I sort of saw happening with Marc Camille, and the way what you guys have sort of talked about is that over the period of time, things would echo, and I would see my own kind of constellation of images developing. A lot of the films were shot on this 4x8 piece of plywood that was my table in the studio, and it just became, just sort of almost developed this patina through so much action happening on it. There was also about a 4x8 area in the studio that I would shoot over and over again in composite. A lot of the films it's hard to maybe see, but it's shot, there's two pieces of footage that are turned on their side and then composited, so there's usually a center line going down the middle of them. It's hard to see, but this is into a mirror, and I'm in a lot of the videos, but sort of almost as an artifact. Another tabletop piece. A lot of these also, a lot of my photographic work is black and white, so the films are also a way of kind of dealing with color. But it's funny, this kind of reminds me of one of Tom's early pieces. It's funny when you put three people together, how sort of there's a Gestalt theory that happens where everything just kind of goes together. But I just want to end on, just take us out of the crawl space and hopefully out into the light a little bit. So, thank you. Is there more? Or?
Yeah, there's no more images.
How about, oh.
That's backstage of the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Somehow appropriate.
So yeah, thanks again, Kelly.
Well, thank you, everyone, and for spending so much time kind of going through your own work. That I learned some things myself that I didn't know before, even about someone I know so well. So thank you. God, there's so many different things that we could talk about. Where to start is sort of the biggest question. I mean, one of the things that struck me maybe throughout all of your different presentations was this kind of reversal where what really needed to be sort of domesticated or dealt with, or which was the more difficult place. And this is what you're kind of touching on when you mentioned that you went into a panic in the studio, was the space where art was shown, or that was, the architectural masterpiece, like the Breuer building, which went feral, right? And you kind of reclaimed that space. And even with Marc Camille's work, always kind of negotiating the difference between his personal environment and what shifts when it's then brought out into an exhibition space. And maybe just talk a little bit more about just that. Like, what is it about the space of exhibition or allowing people into your space that then becomes the sort of like this kind of reverse of that's the thing that then needs to be domesticated in some way. Does that make sense? Yes.
I mean, how, I don't know if I'm interpreting, I'm just gonna go for it. Go for it. I actually, I accept this sort of contract as an artist that your work has to get shown at a certain point, but I think from a very early point, I've always felt it always felt like exhibitions were a little incorrect, like they were never quite right, or there was something, it's fine, but like it's just something I was thinking about with Marc Camille's work, or for me at least, thinking back on this kind of strange, weird, nascent work I was doing in this apartment, that there's sometimes something that's so beautiful at the moment of when something's getting, an idea's being born, or that you're sort of figuring something out, that you don't actually want to share it publicly entirely, or that when you do, it gets something that's private or interior gets pushed so completely into the public realm, it loses something that's a little effervescent and fragile. And I think that for me, I find myself working through lots of different mediums just to keep myself floating a little bit, to maybe hold on to that strange, neither here nor there type of space. I don't know if that's addressing your question, but I think about that a lot, and just I feel like I'm constantly navigating that, like putting myself out there and also wanting to hide certain things.
Is that, and anyone can answer, but this kind of playing around with autobiography. I mean, Tom, you even title a lot of your work after your own name, or this kind of, and Kirsty, I think you probably experience this a lot when you're kind of really looking closely at where artists work or live or both. How important or how mutable and how much autobiography or fiction kind of play off each other, and like how do you kind of keep that going when you're putting, when self-portraiture is so much a part of your work, or referencing your own past and history is so much a part of your own work, and even like the things that you've worn or the bits and pieces of your house or whatever. How do you negotiate that to keep it so that it's neither here nor there, like you're saying?
Well, for me, it's a funny thing. It's always a process for me of oscillation. And I think that I'm both, or sometimes the two poles, which might be earnestness on the one hand, meaning if I take a T-shirt and work that into a piece, right? And it happens to be my T-shirt. I mean that. I mean that it's my T-shirt, and that it has something to do with my body, and that it references my body. But I'm also aware that there's a lot of fiction going on here at the same time, and that there are a lot of decoys that are going on, and I'm always earnest in my pursuit of trying to figure out what it means to present oneself and how it's read. But I never forget about the fact that there's an audience, and that audience is looking for some notion of authenticity, whether that be a brushstroke, or whether that be a T-shirt, or whether that be one's own apartment. So I'm always simultaneously investing in that and questioning the reality of that. That's where works like Burrville, this series I did, or Who Tommaso Was, or Thomas the Imposter, or all of these they're sort of decoys. Do they actually say anything about me? Well, maybe they do, but maybe not in the way that they seem to.
And I think this a very similar kind of thing occurs in the work of Marc Camille, because you have this sense that you are in the most private space, in his home. You see him in his home, surrounded by his personal belongings. And even though, for all of this time, 40 years, he's been working with his own personal home and, making that the basis of his work, and then constantly navigating this transition from private to public. There's nothing diaristic about his work at all, right. Which is, even though there's all of these, everything is very personal in it, but it's so choreographed, and the staging is so clear, with this image that I kept showing, this kind of ambiguity. And I think the thing that I kind of came to realize or feel about his work is that he makes this, these divisions, instead of being a hard line between interior, exterior, or private and public, he kind of expands the boundary so that becomes a territory, and then kind of inhabits that ambiguous territory that can kind of move in all of these different directions. So although it's about him and his persona and his image and his things that he surrounds himself with, they're always kind of moving within this kind of ambiguous zone.
I think that the notion of ambiguity is super important for Marc Camille, and I think it runs through everything in a certain way. And one thing that I was struck by, well, maybe I've always been struck by it, but it really kind of came to me full on with this exhibition, is the notion that he uses design in a way that is perhaps different than a designer might use design. He uses design that almost becomes, I won't say a metaphor, but it starts to be about the whole design of living and the kind of constructed subject in a way. There's almost a cartoon quality there, right? And how a cartoon stands in for reality. So to your point, everything is personal and nothing is at the same time is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I think, Tom, I was reading an interview with you, and the person asked what your media was, or what your context was as an artist. And I think you said something like you take context on as like a type of, that you just inhabit it for a minute, and that they're not really like definitions as such, but kind of roles that you play. Like you're playing the role of the sculptor, you're playing the role of this, that, and the other. Right. Which I thought was kind of an interesting way to describe the practice.
Well, that's something that I feel, this is why I resisted showing maybe some things like the folding screens that I've done, because I thought that then the empathy between artists might be taken as a type of object, which I find kind of uninteresting ultimately. Whereas perhaps I'm very empathetic to Marc Camille's notion of performing his role, and that ultimately that's the subject of the work in a certain way, and plays very much into this notion of the apartment being the stage set in a certain way, right? But in fact, at the same time, he's extremely veiled about certain biographical facts, which I find that discrepancy very fascinating. But it's certainly very intentional, very consciously crafted. Post-war. We were saying earlier, it's the only male artist that I know who does not give his birth date, which I find fascinating. And that also plays with gender, of course. Well,
I think one of since you mentioned gender, I think one of the things that I've learned as I've sat with this show for the last couple of months is just how many things people think are him. Like, oh, he's this, that, he is this type of person. And that these kind of shards of autobiography actually add up to something, and that you are this type of, guy doing this type of stuff and with this kind of sexuality. And in fact, like, we're not given any of those, and none of that is here. There is no definitive answer whatsoever. And I think that there's and another thing that has come up is kind of people trying to get into what the political content of this work is and what this exhibition is. And I think a lot of it stems from that very early period in the 1970s, and this kind of idea that the house and the domestic, and even this idea of decoration, was feminine and feminized, and that a lot of feminist artists were dealing with the work of the home or the work of the woman as artistic labor and as artistic content. So I wondered if, in any of from your points of view, like what about the house or even different types of buildings or personal items has a political charge, and how you could define it.
I think with Marc Camille, it was definitely a political decision not to be making work. He just graduated from the Slade, and he was basically offered this workspace. There was a string of houses on this street, Approach Road, were owned by this housing association, and they were about to be torn down. They had for a certain limited period, they were given to artists, basically. You could apply for one and get one. And so Marc Camille moved into one of these that was supposed to be a live-work space, and a bunch of other artists that he knew or didn't know moved into the street, into the other houses next door to him. And he said, that he'd walk past, there'd be these strip lights, and they'd be, throwing paint on giant canvases or working with power tools and making things, and he consciously decided that was not what he wanted to do. He didn't want to make anything. He wanted to be at home and rather use it as a live work space to make the work into the living, and there's this kind of great quote where he says, "To live well became the priority," so it was, and that's very much a political gesture in the early 1970s, where there was not much, you could be a feminist, but if you were a man, then your role as an artist was pretty kind of clearly defined. So I think for him to then enter this feminine territory and that ambiguity, and to use that kind of as his method for being an artist was, that was extremely unusual at that time.
And I think something about the idea of pleasure and leisure continues to be oddly unusual now. I don't know what your experiences are, but I know that most of my day is just all transactions all the time. We're getting this done, we need to do this. The level of depth in conversation is something that I have to actively seek out and carve away time for, particularly with artists. That space, that open space or openness doesn't exist in my daily routine as much. And that was something that Marc Camille and I really invested in working on the show. So,
and also boredom, maybe.
Boredom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or just that kind of luxuriating and sort of time misspent, or not spent productively in this transaction. And, this constant, looking out the window or drinking from the teacup, or it's very, weird kind of version of Proust or something. I'm not sure.
I think it's a very very European position. I think that's some of the complexity of translation in a certain way, don't you think? It's this kind of pose, European pose that has to do with wasting time in a certain way, and I think it's a completely different cultural frame than the American anxiety of work and productivity, and so that I think is a very political sort of presence throughout the work, and I see it also in this, and I see him in the tradition of somebody, like Gilbert and George that way, in the sort of durational aspect of a kind of performance of nothingness in a certain way.
And that maybe sort of explains what you were talking about, how there's all these expectations when maybe not just with Marc Camille, but I know I've also had it too, where as soon as you're in the work, people assume that the work is about you. But that's not actually the case. I can say from my own experience, I was in a lot of the early work, especially just out of convenience. There was no one else around at that moment. And
you had no friends.
Yeah. Well, actually, I had a friend who I stuffed into the dish cabinet, but she was too small, and it didn't work. So I just realized that because I'm so tall, I had to, I did it. Couldn't do it now, I assure you. But I have a good friend who's a documentary filmmaker, and she was talking about, she just shot this film in the Atlas Mountains, and I won't go into it, but one of the things that she was surprised by in shooting this kind of documentary footage, many times at which fiction would sort of erupt unexpectedly. And I've been finding that with myself, where I'm constantly staging these situations to photograph or film, or sort of hope for something to spiral out. And lately I've been taking portraits of other people, which has been my way of, and so it's like nonfiction's been creeping into this sort of stage reality that I've set up, and I think I'm constantly looking for ways to break my own frame a little bit. But it's one of the things I really found I was entranced by the show, is that, yeah, this sort of this it's an interior world, but the doors are constantly being opened to it. It's not like a private hermetic, in a way that I think I would probably have misinterpreted this show if I approached it thinking that this guy was just sort of like an old school design, like, Gesamtkunst, how do you say Gesamtkunst? Or whatever. The total art, where, the design, or this Bauhaus type of, I do design and textiles and pottery. I think there's something way more nuanced and beautiful about it. And that it can intersect with a very rigorous exhibition, sort of formal, could stand up to a minimal sculpture, but could also stand up to like a Florine Stettheimer painting or Fassbinder film.
Yeah, well, you're not the only person that picked up on that, so that really blew my mind.
Chantal Ackerman a lot,
Yeah.
especially the video, which is sort of something you could easily miss, not too easily, but it's just this. I got that sense of just wasted time, or this sort of, I don't know, it's not the best way of saying it, but imagining him just letting a camera linger through his apartment with no expectation of anything happening. So even that idea of transaction, or that expectation, is also something that comes up in conversations about film and cinema, where you have narrative film and you have film where nothing happens, like a Chantal Ackerman movie. Her first film was called Le Chambre, which was just a camera going around 360 degrees of a small room in an apartment. So that's one of the things that's one of the ways I sort of process this show, is also filmically.
Well, I didn't realize how late it got, and I got a signal that we should wrap it up, and also maybe leave some time for anyone to ask questions. So, yes, fast.
Thank you very much. Forgive me if I'm asking a question that you answered already when I stepped out for a minute. The vibrancy of the colors of the 60s and 70s, the abstract expressionists of the late 40s and 50s, are we afraid of that kind of chaos, that the postmodern colors are more subdued and the message is more subtle?
Sure.
You go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that when, just in terms of Marc Camille's choices about colors, he said that when he was originally making this first interior, he wanted to kind of make it feel like a French hotel, provincial French hotel room, sometime in the post-war years in the 50s. So I think that he's really thinking about, this kind of palette that's like everything slightly faded, nuanced, kind of in between colors, rather than going for primary expressive ones.
Thank you. I have kind of two questions, but it doesn't matter. One
Go for
is Memphis. Was he interested in Group Memphis, and what was his kind of relation to that, and how he was thinking about that? And the other thing is like this character of like kind of like a sublime dandyism.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of a dark version of it is this character in Against Nature in Huysman's book. I'm just thinking about, like, was that a reference that he was thinking about? I mean, those are the two things that kind of came to my mind when looking at the show. So
He definitely knows Memphis and Satsas, and we talked about that a little bit because he was, starting to make furniture objects around the same time period. But there was also a lot of other stuff going on at that same time, like the sort of tail end of pattern and decoration in this country, and other decoration and design waves in Europe, which I think, Memphis kind of netted some of that together. And obviously, some of the furniture kind of has that playful, like, dysfunctionality, over the top lamination color vibe to it. So yes and no. I mean, I don't think directly, but certainly it was someone he was aware of, or people that he was aware of and on his mind. But then I think the character of the dandy is there. This kind of, always impeccably dressed, sort of maybe dilettante type character that is also incredibly well read and articulate. And yeah, I think I think there is a lot of character and artifice and performance. He began his career, really, he became known in London as someone who was performative, with these two big installations called Celebration Real Life and Enough Tyranny. And he was there and he was interacting with people when he made these sort of immersive type environments that were kind of about nothing. I mean, there were record players there and disco lights, and there's kind of this environment for something to happen, but nothing really happened. And the idea, I think, was that you kind of missed it. And you were there the next morning and like had tea with them, but you missed the party the night before, So I think that idea of the performative lingers for many years after that. And it's something that we tried to bring out in the show, especially in that main room with the carpet and the sort of more theatrical lighting. But so you went from those to these like kind of slide readings, these performative readings, and then, slowly but surely he kind of trickled out. But this idea that like something's going on and something's happened, but maybe nothing, I think is really there. Yeah.
And I think also the idea of being decadent, and the decadence in that Huysman's book is definitely something that he takes on. I mean, this just the whole activity. There's something incredibly decadent about that, like long shot of lying on the bed on your own with your, with your face out of view, or looking out of the window, or just leaning on the mantelpiece. I mean, there is this just kind of weight and decadence of time being spent, and the indulgence of deciding to live, trying to live well your priority. I mean, it's incredible. And also just to follow up on that note about performance, when Marc Camille first moved into this apartment on Approach Road, he made a performance there. There was a performance that he'd done in public called Tableau, which was also an incredible piece where he's just, on this like dressing table, a little bit like the one out there with various bric-a-brac on it. He has his face down, his arms on the table, his head lying on his arms, reflected in a mirror, and that's the performance. And when he moved into his house, he performed Tableau in his empty apartment for himself, without an audience. And I think that was also like maybe a transition for him away from the public performance where he was present, and then into this more kind of photographed or kind of staged, where the stage was this interior, which then got kind of exported in various photographic or other kinds of forms. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, then I'll just say thank you, everyone, for coming, and all of you guys for being here. And that was really great. Thank you so much. Thank you.